Dawn came to Coruscant like a quiet confession. The city that never slept did not awaken so much as turn a page. Light sliding over durasteel and transparasteel, as if someone had drawn a soft brush across the planet's endless plains. The traffic lanes still glowed with their sleepless lines, but the hard edge of night was blunted, neon sobered into something gentler, and the upper atmosphere winds smoothed the last unruly wisps of smog like a hand stroking a child's hair until it lay flat. Bail Organa stood at the edge of his balcony, on the 38th level of a tower in the Senate district, a carafe of Alderanian tea cooling between his hands. He wore a cloak against the thinness of the morning air that only existed at these heights, the kind that made you breathe just a bit deeper to be sure you'd gotten enough. Far below him the Senate building rose with its familiar assurance, the domed roof like a promise he had helped keep since his earliest days as a junior senator. The building was as much a machine as a monument, he thought, and he had spent his life learning how to coax its gears into alignment with conscience. Today, he would be a wrench. The message sat on the small table inside his apartment, still projecting on mute, as though the past would be polite and wait if he turned his head. It showed a sterile room with walls the color of a winter sky, and in the center, a Kaminoan medframe with restraints. A clone trooper lay upon it. Bail did not need the sound to remember the words. They were already bedded into him like gravel beneath the skin. A chip, the Kaminoan had said, her voice a candle flame that did not flicker. A regulatory device, a failsafe. She had run a delicate finger along an image of a cross-sectioned human head and tapped gently at a sliver of something that had no business being where it was. It had a name in a catalog, a part number, a provenance that could be traced through a lattice of contracts and payments, as carefully woven and thick as any spider's web. It had purchasers too, though these grew vague and then vaguer, until the paper dissolved into mist, and the mist smelled faintly of ozone and old promises. Failsafe, she had said again when the clone sat up, eyes slow with sedation and the cutting clarity of fear. For what contingency? Bail had not been in the room to ask, but the question echoed along the recording's corridor and reached him anyway. The clone in the frame had spoken his name with care, each syllable as if it could make him real again. CT 5,555, the soldier had said. And then, like a soft correction learned at a mess hall table, fives. Bail had watched the man's face as the story poured out, a brother in arms seizing like a puppet jerked on a string, a post-mortem finding a secret no one had meant the clones to discover, a chase, a plea, a pistol's bright punctuation in an empty square. Bail knew what the end of the story looked like without needing the cameras to provide the rest. Coruscant was full of places where truth ended that way. He exhaled slowly. The tea had gone cool in his cup and steeped long enough to bite back. He welcomed the bitterness. It kept him awake in a way that had nothing to do with stimulants. He had not slept much. A handful of hours at most. Split like a broken coin. In the spaces between, he had walked his apartment, the silent rooms lit by the glow of the city, and the soft planetary heartbeat of passing traffic. He had palmed the carved wooden edge of the small Alderanian shrine he kept in the corner, thumb finding the familiar divot worn into the wood by his father and his father before him. He had stared at the holophotos on his credenza until they were constellations. Braha laughing with her head tipped back, the curve of her throat bright with a pendant, the white arcs of Alderain snow, the blue plains of its glaciers, a sky you could drink, a portrait of intent-faced classmates from his first term in the Senate school, a boy among boys trying on the posture of responsibility. The scent of Alderanian cedar oil on the carved shrine lingered on his hand. He set the cup down and stepped inside. The apartment's lights warmed in response to his presence, dim to bright in a polite gradient. His datapad chimed twice. A message from Mon Mothma, received in the middle of the night and read at once. Another from Padme, also read, and his reply sent with the kind of care one uses when placing a delicate thing in a courier's hand. Mon had written, succinct and spare, that she stood with him. She had asked nothing and demanded nothing. She trusted his timing and his counsel, even as she signaled her readiness to act. The final line, "Be safe, my friend," had made him smile in a way that was nearly a grimace. In the last 3 years that phrase had been a kind of benediction between them, often written in jest, and more often meant in earnest. Padmé's message had been warmer and quieter. She had asked if he'd eaten. She had told him to breathe. She had said with the directness that had always made him glad to share a chamber with her, that there would be a price. Speaking truth under an empire of half-truths carried interest. He was not naive about the cost. If the recording and the attached documents went public, if he stood on the Senate floor and read the words into the record, the galaxy would tremble, and there would be those who would make sure it did so in a way that crushed rather than loosened. In the kitchen, his protocol droid stirred. "Your Excellency," the droid said, voice pitched to a low courtesy. "Do you require a conveyance order to be placed?" "I'll walk the first part," Bale said, fastening the clasp of his cloak. "Then I'll take the East tram. There's weather moving in. I want to feel it." "Then I won't." "Very good, Your Excellency." The droid hesitated with a politeness learned from watching humans. "A message has been queued from Captain Antilles for your review when you return." "Send it through," Bale said, and paused so the small projector in the kitchen island could spill the captain's face into the morning air. Ramus looked both very young and very tired. He reported that the anonymization on the files was complete, that the distribution nodes were ready, that the moment Bale began to speak on the Senate floor, a dozen independent Holonet outlets would receive copies they could not be prevented from playing without crashing half the core. He reported, too, that contingency routes were in place if things went poorly. A handful of secure servers he refused to describe, which made Bale trust them more. "Thank you," Bale said when the message ended. He stood still a heartbeat longer, looking at the island of darkness on which the projection had floated, and then turned away. He picked up the data chip, shut down the silent recording, and slipped both into the slim inner pocket of his cloak, where a sewn-in layer of metallic mesh made it harder to scan. Then he breathed again, as Padmé had advised, and went out into the morning. Coruscant greeted him with the sound of air rushing through the gap between towers. The city had many different winds, each with its own personality, each telling him something about altitude and time. The one that met him now was an old friend he called the Ribbon, a steady, narrow current that traced its way along a maintenance channel and then spilled over the balcony lip. It smelled faintly of rain. He stood a moment, letting it take the loose edges of his cloak and tug them into a line, then walked to the private access corridor that ran around the building like a belt. He passed other doors, other balconies, other mornings. A Bothan counselor jogged in place to warm himself before the day's machinations. A human diplomat, new enough to still wear hope like a medal, stood straight-backed and stared at the Senate dome as if staring could stake a claim. A Twi'lek aide tucked a strand of Leku-hugging fabric more tightly under her chin and finished a cup of something steaming. No one stopped him. Courtesy and habit made them nod instead. By the time he entered the East Tram station, a handful of other senators had joined the platform. They spoke in that low Senate voice that never carried a single word, but always carried meaning. Bale felt eyes turn toward him as he approached the line for the executive car. He nodded to some. He met the gaze of others. He had spent long enough in these corridors to know when gossip was merely bored, and when it had caught a scent. This morning was not bored. The tram slid along its magnetic bed inside, its doors open. Bale stepped inside. The car smelled faintly of lubricant and clean cloth, the polished scent of something that had been made. He took a seat by the long window and watched the platform retract. The domed roof of the Senate closed the distance as the tram skimmed the gap, and then the door sighed, and the day began as though beginning were simply a habit it had developed. Across the aisle, Mon Mothma sat alone, and then, seeing him, moved to sit beside him. She wore white, as she often did when she meant to be seen as clean and plain. Mon could wear white without looking simple. It was one of her gifts. She laid a hand on the bench between them, palm flat, as if to steady the car itself. "How much did you sleep?" she asked softly. Enough to string a thought, he said. And you? Enough to keep you company. She didn't smile. Padme says she will be on the floor by the second hour. She had a mediation at dawn that she couldn't escape without raising suspicion. She's worried about the Chancellor's staff positioning guards in the antechambers. She's right to be, Bale said. But if we let that keep us from speaking, then they've already succeeded. Mon's gaze went to the window. The tram slipped along the curve of the dome and slowed at the recessed doors that led to the private corridors. She watched the doors open with the same attention she gave a difficult vote. When you say these words, she said finally, there will be a silence in the chamber we will not have heard before. Even during the first day of the war, when the vote went through and half the body sobbed and the other half cheered, there was noise. Today there will be quiet. And then? Bale asked. And then a storm. She slid him a glance. I hope you brought an umbrella. They disembarked with the small group of senators who used the same corridor, an even mix of loyalists, neutrals, and those like themselves, whom the loyalists never quite named but always recognized. The hall felt like a throat clearing itself. Masameda stood near the inner doors with his staff balanced against the floor, the old ceremonial rhythm of it tapping a beat. He impressed upon those entering the chamber that the Chancellor would take petitions after the third hour, that there would be a closed committee meeting on supply contracts in the fifth. His eyes, amphibian calm, watched the senators as one watches fish through glass. When Bale approached, Mas dipped his head the smallest permissible amount. Senator Organa, he said. A pleasure. I received your request to address the chamber. If this is, as I have been told, a speech of some length, I hope it has been edited for clarity. The docket is regrettably crowded. Gravely crowded, Bale said, allowing his own tone to cool. One might almost suspect a famine of time had been declared. Mas's small smile did not change shape. I have learned not to suspect anything on Coruscant. It is better for one's health. Curious, Mon said. I had always thought suspicion was good exercise. Mas' eyes moved from her to Bale and back. He tapped his staff once, permission mixed with warning. The chair recognizes that which is given to it with respect. The Chancellor expects decorum. Then he will be pleased, Bale said, and offered a precisely weighted inclination of his head that 100 years of Alderaanian court life had honed to an edge. He and Mon moved past him into the chambers dim. The Senate was a vastness designed to make all things small. Even with the repulsor pods hanging like fruit in their careful rows, even with the bright coiling of lights along the rim of each pod indicating life and energy and attention, the space seemed to swallow sound. Bale knew from years in this bowl that the trick was to speak as if to a single person, a skill that had the paradoxical effect of making everyone think he spoke to them alone. They took their pod. The controls felt familiar under his hand, the gentle rise as the pod drifted out from the wall, the sensation like stepping off a high stair in the dark, and discovering there was another beneath you, after all. The Chancellor's podium at the center of the bowl was a stillness among currents. The crimson figures of the Royal Guard were parentheses that turned into a sentence when they moved. Bale looked down at his hands where they rested on the railing. They were large, capable hands, the knuckles nicked from a childhood of lessons that involved leather and wood and the practicalities of mountain life. He had always liked that about himself, that he could do delicate things without looking delicate doing them. Today his hands looked like a man's hands on the edge of a chasm. He set his shoulders and exhaled. He rose and requested recognition. The request traveled along its paths like a drop of bright dye along a vein. It reached the central console. It had to pass through a series of permissions, any one of which could stall or stutter. When the confirmation light came, small and green on the rail in front of him, Bale felt his heart settle further down in his chest, as if preparing itself to be a weight. Senator Organa of Alderaan is recognized, the amplifiers said in their steady intimacy, and the murmurs in the chamber pooled like water behind a closed gate. Bale began as he had decided he must. Briefly, simply, and with the respect that made it impossible to accuse him of theater. He spoke of the clone army that had been commissioned without a Senate vote, He reminded the chamber of Master Sifo Dyas and the fog that had hung in the record since his death. He reminded them of Camino, a planet that had not been in the archive until it had been discovered by a knight of the order whose steward had once been Qui-Gon, whose habit had been to go where the currents led rather than where the channels were cut. He let the names and the place names anchor the room. Then he said, gently, and without changing the pitch of his voice, that he had before him evidence of a further irregularity. He did not use the word abomination. He did not say betrayal. He said that in the manufacture of each clone soldier, a remarkable feat of science that he would not diminish, something had been placed that did not belong to the clone's making. A device designed to override that soldier's will in a moment of crisis. He said the word will as if it were the most sacred of secular words, and in Bale's lexicon, it likely was. He raised the data chip in his hand, so it caught the chamber lights. I intend, he said, to enter into the public record the following material evidence: a confidential Kaminoan registry of functional implant devices used in all Phase I and Phase II clones, a chain of custody for procurement orders routed through shell entities, and a recorded testimony detailing an attempted disclosure by a clone soldier, known as Fives. He said the name softly and let it hang. The silence Mon had predicted arrived like a tide. It was not empty. Bale could hear the room breathing. He could hear how breath changed when a body was told something it did not want to have to hold. Finally, Palpatine leaned toward his microphone. The Chancellor's voice, always a velvet instrument, met the silence as if it had been composed with it in mind. Senator Organa, he said, no one in this chamber denies the right, indeed the duty, to examine the means by which this republic wages its necessary war. But these are serious allegations presented at a delicate time. The security of the republic must not be compromised by a well-intentioned but ill-considered public airing of sensitive material. Then so. Bale inclined his head. I respect the Chancellor's concern. I submit that the greater compromise is a secret that undermines the very faith that binds soldier to citizen and citizen to Senate. If the men who fight in our name are not fully their own, then our victories are poison. Palpatine's pause was subtle enough to be mistaken for magnanimity. Then, he said, let us be cautious and thorough. I propose we move this discussion to a closed committee where experts can review the material and report back to the body. We must not provide our enemies a spectacle. Monsieur. Bale heard the word enemies and felt how it moved through the chamber, past the aisles and up to the pods. How it cradled some and pressed down upon others. He let it pass. With respect, he said, this does not belong behind doors. The trust of our people cannot be restored in private, and our soldiers deserve, at minimum, the knowledge of what has been done to them. And now, he nodded once, the signal to Antilles and to the distributed network of little vanishing servers and mirrored caches and very tired people who had waited all night. Somewhere across the city, a dozen holonet broadcasters received a packet that opened itself in their systems like a flower, and a voice, calm, precise, Kaminoan, began to speak over images of a man on a med frame. The Senate shook itself. People began to stand. A hut barked something that could be read as laughter or fury. A Wookiee's low moan rolled around the bowl. Mon's knuckles were white on the rail. Masameda's staff struck the floor once, twice, a third time. Ritual that had become reaction. Palpatine's eyes, gentle as a doctor's that did not mind making you bleed, lifted to Bale. For an instant, the Chancellor looked what he had seldom allowed himself to look, old. Then, the moment passed. He lifted one hand, palm down, a soothing gesture he had taught a galaxy to obey, and said in a velvet held just so, order. Across the city, in a barracks tucked under an administrative tower, with a view of nothing but conduit and sky, Captain Rex of the 501st sat on the edge of his bunk and watched the broadcast on a small projector, balanced on his locker. The hollow's blue light made his hands look colder than they were. Around him, other men watched, just as still. The clone medtech, 2 bunks down, had stopped mid-polish on a tray and stood with the cloth in his hand like a flag of truce. Rex had the face his brothers had, but there was a way he had of holding it as if speech were a blade you checked for nicks with your thumb before you used it. He felt the old wound of Five's name reopen as cleanly as if the medics had kept the incision sealed. He hoped, wildly, and against the discipline that was a skin to him, that the name would be spoken with enough clarity to make it real again. It was. The Caminoan voice glided through Five's account with that same candle-steady calm. A cross-section of a clone's head appeared above the projector, a circle of light within light, and a slender pale finger tapped a sliver of impossible. "Rex," Jesse said roughly from his left. The sound scraped against emotion. "Carking, Rex." "I know," Rex said. He did. He had known in private, in the whispering hours after a mission when he and Skywalker and General Kenobi sat together and tried to turn the impossible thing over in their hands, like an object warmed by passing from palm to palm. Anakin had looked as if someone had told him stars were mechanical. Obi-Wan had looked at the middle distance and said the word chip as if tasting it for poison. Fives had died while they hesitated, and in their hesitation had been a lifetime. Now the thing they had held between them lay in the middle of the floor, plain as a mess tray. "You think the Chancellor?" Jesse began, then stopped. There were habits even shock did not break. Rex closed his eyes slightly, like a man inclined to prayer. Anakin would be on planet. He would be watching this too. He would be feeling what Rex felt. The floor shifting, as if the deck plates had loosened and the ship were reading the currents differently. Anakin would want to move. He would want to do something with his hands that fixed. Rex took a breath and stood. "Medical," he said to Kix, who had not moved. "When this is over, I want a full brief on how you find these things. If they exist. How we can see them, what it takes to remove them. If they exist." Kix repeated, not arguing, tasting the words as a medic tastes a culture dish. "We're soldiers," Rex said. "We verify what we can, and we act on what we must." Kix nodded with a snap, discipline catching like a handhold. "Yes, Captain." Rex looked down at his hands on his thighs. He'd removed his gloves when they'd returned from their stint at the War Council. His palms were nicked with the small, steady injuries of a working life. A parallel set of scars crossed his knuckles, where armor had not fit exactly as it should. He turned one hand over and imagined the tiny sliver of wrong nestled in the flesh beneath his skull. He imagined what shape his face would make if someone told him to shoot the only men he had in this world. He imagined if. He did not let the pictures play themselves to the end. He thought instead of the general who had not learned to give up. He thought of a senator with a voice that made him think of home, though he had never had one. He felt an odd tightness at the back of his throat that had nothing to do with contagion, and everything to do with a word he had not needed, until this moment: mercy. On the far side of the city, in a high office whose windows looked out on the Senate dome, and on the anvil gray cloud that had settled over it like an opinion, the Chancellor turned away from the broadcast that had appeared unbidden upon his private screen. The Royal Guard, their stillness a kind of talent, stood as if they had been carved and polished for this particular density of air. Saint-Pistage cleared his throat, which was the bureaucratic equivalent of screaming. "Chancellor," he said, and stopped, mouth working. "The distribution points. Our contacts at... Aha. Central Holonet, report a cascade. We can shut down some channels, but... the redundancies. Let them run," Palpatine said, sounding to Pestage like a tired father who had seen toddlers track mud into a parlor and had decided to change the parlor rather than clean the child. "We will convene an emergency review panel. Mass will announce it. We will praise Senator Organa's vigilance and urge caution. We will ask our citizens to turn to their local representatives for steadiness. We will show our soldiers the gratitude that has always been their due. Mento." "And," Sly Moore said, soft enough that only Palpatine would be sure he'd heard, "we will begin preparations to move what must be moved sooner than we had hoped." Palpatine did not turn. The role of soft voice in his chambers had been Sly's for many years. He allowed it to pass through him. In another age, in another telling of himself, he might have sighed. Instead, he stood as if listening to the wind, and without looking, lifted a hand. Sly stepped forward, and the datapad she placed in his palm hummed with a dozen living threads. "General Skywalker?" Palpatine asked, still looking at the window. "On planet," Sly murmured. "Security Council this morning, then Temple. He was to meet with Master Kenobi in the afternoon." "Not now," Palpatine said almost kindly. He turned then, and the kindness in his face would have comforted a child. "We will bring him here. An anchor is most useful when the water is rough." Anakin Skywalker watched the broadcast from a conference room, with too much glass, and not enough breath. The room lived on the edge of the temple like a thought one was not supposed to have. He had the holo projected low over the table, so the blue light filled the hollows in his hands, and he kept his fingers splayed as if to catch what fell through them. Obi-Wan stood at the far windows with his arms folded, and his expression like weather, moving in layers. He had watched half the broadcast reflected in glass, as was his habit, when he'd rather have been somewhere else within himself. Now he turned, his beard catching the low light, and came to stand beside Anakin so their shoulders nearly touched. "It appears Senator Organa has chosen to loosen the rug while we're all standing on it," Obi-Wan said, voice quiet as the corner of a smile. Anakin huffed a breath that was not laughter. "He's doing what he thinks is right," he said. "Maybe what is right? Perhaps both." Obi-Wan's eyes fell to the projection, where the Kaminoan's finger tapped its secret with infinite patience. His face changed very slightly. Qui-Gon would have said the Force has a way of insisting. Anakin's throat worked. At times like this, the memory of Obi-Wan's old master came to him with a bitterness he did not like to admit to. Qui-Gon was a story he had never had a chance to finish reading, a book that had been closed the day he opened it. "What does the Force insist now?" he asked, sharper than he'd meant. "That we look," Obi-Wan said, continuing as if the edge of Anakin's voice had been a simple wind to lean into, "and do not look away." Anakin nodded. It felt like a small, stubborn thing to do with his neck, as if he were wrenching a valve open. He was about to say more when the door chimed. The tone was temple clear, no politics in the note. And yet, it made him tense. Obi-Wan's mouth compressed in that way it did when the obvious had often enough been unwise. "Enter," he said. A temple aide stepped in, bowed, and spoke the name in the careful formality of announcement. "The Supreme Chancellor's office requests General Skywalker's presence at once." Obi-Wan's brow did not climb so much as breathe. Anakin did not look at him. It was an old habit between them, this not looking, when to look would be to know too much about the Uter's face. Anakin rose. He smoothed his tunic, as if returning his body to a shape the galaxy expected. In the corner of his eye, the blue hologram flared with the brightness of the Medframe's surgical lights, and for a moment the room smelled faintly of disinfectant and tasted of metal. Obi-Wan's hand brushed his sleeve. Not a hold, only a vector. "Be steady," he said. Anakin answered with something between a nod and a jerk of the chin. "You too," he said, and left the room before he could be asked what he meant. Padme Amidala Nebari hurried through the Senate's lower corridors, with her head lowered and her hood up, as if she were one of her own handmaidens, which made her smile despite herself. Dorme would have teased her if she could see it. Sabe would have adjusted the line of the hood by so much as to make the disguise into a posture. She missed them both in the grim, practical way that one misses a hand during a task that has no room for sentiment. She had watched Bale's speech with her hand flat on her desk. When he said Five's name, memory crested and took her. She had seen the boy's friend on the landing platform, with eyes like a shutter, stuck half open. She had seen Anakin's face when he returned from the confrontation no one should have forced him to make. Now, as her feet found their old route through the warren behind the Senate's public halls, she touched the brim of the hood and breathed the smell of dust and resin that old buildings share regardless of planet. She had a packet in the interior pocket of her cloak. Hard evidence of the kind that cannot be argued away by charm. It contained procurement codes and signatures. It contained money. It contained two names that, if read aloud into the right room, could make doors that had never been meant to close begin to swing. She reached the end of a corridor, checked to see if the camera's red eye was on, and then slipped through a service door into the antechamber of Committee Hall 7. Mon was already there, standing with her arms crossed, watching a display that showed the chamber outside fracturing into its usual kaleidoscope of complications. "Is he all right?" Padme asked without preamble. "Us all right, as one can be while riding the knife one has thrown," Mon said dryly. "You have something for me." Padme nodded and drew the packet out. "This is the thread to pull when we are in the committee. It leads to subsidiaries, but the names that signed for the funds are their real hands. They felt very safe when they signed their approvals. The Chancellor has been careful about many things. He could not be careful about everything. Mon gave her a long look that contained, as it often did, admiration and rebuke braided together like white and red threads. "Promise me," Mon said softly, "that you will not go home alone tonight." Padme's mouth curved. "I won't be able to. Naboo's delegation has scheduled me until the late hours. They're worried their ships will be searched because of the broadcast." "And will they be?" "Oh, of course." She glanced toward the chamber doors. "And you?" "I will go home with a friend," Mon said. "We will sit in a kitchen and drink something that insists on making our throats warm, and we will not say the word empire aloud even once." Padme pulled her hood a little deeper. "I'm going to see Bail." "Be careful," Mon said. "The Chancellor will too." The committee room beneath Palpatine's office was paneled in old wood from worlds that had names he had helped write into history. He liked the way light fell on those panels, the way the grain made a subtle topography running downhill from the ceiling to the wainscot. He liked how the old wood made the senators who met here think of tradition and the safety of precedent, even while he asked them to make new precedents in his favor. Anakin stood with his hands clasped behind his back at the window while he waited. A good soldier's posture. The memory made Palpatine smile privately with something like pride. He let the young man stand a moment longer before he spoke his name. "Anakin," he said, and allowed fatigue into his voice in a way that made it tender. "What a morning." Anakin turned, the set of his jaw both a brace and a threat. "Yes, sir." "Please," Palpatine said, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit. You look as though you haven't breathed since dawn." Anakin didn't sit at first. He stood in that half-stance of a man who has not decided whether to run toward or from. Finally, he lowered himself into the chair as if trusting a step he had not tested. Palpatine sat as well, and made a point of moving slowly, like a man whose bones had begun to keep the weather. "I am not surprised," he said, "that you are upset." "Upset isn't the word," Anakin said. He sounded rough, as if the word had had to scrape its way up his throat. "If this is true, then the men I've been fighting with have been used in a way I can't accept," Palpatine finished gently. "I know. I feel much the same." Anakin's eyes flicked to his face in a way. It was a soldier's glance, testing for truth in the breadth of a heartbeat. "If it's true," he said again. "Yes," Palpatine said. "If." He folded his hands on the desk. The hollows at the base of his fingers made shadows that looked like little pools. "I will not insult you by pretending that all is well, nor will I throw the Senate into chaos by encouraging a public trial by rumor. I will appoint a panel. I will ask for the Order's help in assessing the claims." He leaned forward, the father leaning toward the son. "But I must ask you to do something for me." Anakin lifted his chin. "Seer." "Steady the men," Palpatine said. "This broadcast will be seen in barracks across Coruscant by soldiers whose lives are equal parts duty and habit. Shock is a kind of enemy. There are those," he added, letting his voice lower, "who would use this moment to harm the Republic. Fanatics, separatist agents in senatorial robes. They will fan the flames. I need you to be a firebreak." Anakin's jaw worked. He was, Palpatine knew, a man who did not like metaphors when he was in pain. He wanted a thing he could hold and fix. But this at least gave him something he could put in his hands, even if it was only a line drawn in the mind. "Al-Tarex," he said, and when he said the name his face softened in a way that mattered. "Good," Palpatine said, and reached across the desk to touch Anakin's forearm in a light, paternal pat that a viewing public would have found respectful. I knew I could count on you. When Anakin had gone, walking with that particular force that made a thing like a hall seem too small, Palpatine let his face settle into its private topology. He sat without moving for a moment, listening to the flare and fall of the city's breath around his building. Then he pressed a button near his wrist, and a shutter slid into place over the window. The room dimmed, became smaller by a fraction, became even more his. He turned to Sly Moore where she waited like a thought that had not yet been given words. "Begin," he said. "The accelerated schedule." She inclined her head. "Yes, my lord." Even in the office whose wood pretended to be a forest, the title did not sound like a translation. Bale stepped finally from his pod. His speech entered into the record, the material evidence uploaded and scattered, his body singing with the peculiar exhaustion of a word placed. In the corridor, Padme reached him, touched his sleeve and looked up into his face. It was a look with no pretense in it, a woman's face to a man she knew and trusted, and would argue with if he faltered. "How bad?" she asked. "Worse than we can think," he said, and then, because clarity mattered more than comfort, "but not worse than we can stand." Her hand tightened once on his arm. She slipped a small bundle into his other hand, the one he kept free when he moved through crowds, a habit that had once belonged to self-defense and had become strategy. "Do not read this here," she said. "Open it in your apartment, not in a speeder, not in a lift, not while walking. If you think you are being followed, go where you plan to go anyway." "You are terrifying," he said softly. "Mon called me careful," she returned. I corrected the adjective. He nodded, and in the nod was gratitude and apology, and a promise to be careful where he could. "I need to speak to the guard captain," he said, "and then to the floor leader for the Deveron delegation. If we can keep them from retreating to their corners, we can buy a few hours in which chaos looks like deliberation. Go." She said. He moved away, swallowed by the corridor's peculiar acoustics that turned footsteps into the sound of rain beyond glass. Kix had taken Rex to a storage room in the medical wing that smelled dimly of disinfectant and long-shelved things. He had, with the brisk tenderness of a medic who has kept men alive with less, set up a scanner and explained in careful sentences what he could see and what he could not. He asked Rex to sit, then to lie down, then to be still. "You're very good at being still," Kix said, eyes on the screen. "When you want to be." "I have a lot to sit with," Rex said. "So do I," Kix said, and his mouth twisted in a way that looked like a man adjusting to the fit of a new armor plate. He tapped the display with a gloved finger. "There," he said. "That's what I'd expect to see in a soldier who's had a concussion. Except you haven't had one in months. And this isn't swelling. It's a..." He stopped before he said the word thing. "It's different. Can you take it out?" Rex asked. He asked it in the same tone he would have used to ask if Kix could pull shrapnel from a thigh. "Maybe," Kix said. "But not here. Not safely. We would need a neurotheater and time and a surgeon with hands like a god. And we would need not to be arrested before we finished." Rex sat up. He swung his legs over the side of the cot and scrubbed his hands over his face as if washing without water. "Then we find a place where we can do it. Quietly." Kix looked at him for a long moment. "And you think we can keep this quiet?" "No," Rex said. "But I think we can keep it human." Anakin found Rex and Kix in the hall outside the storage room. He had moved quickly through corridors he knew by their smells. Metal warmed by bodies. The ozone tang of weapons checked and charged. The faint sweet dampness of water recycled and recycled again. The sight of the captain, upright, intent, a line cut straight and clean, lifted something in him that had sunk. "Rex," he said, and in that one word was a dozen missions, 100 decisions made in bursts of a heartbeat and in long, patient hours. "General," Rex said, and it was both acknowledgement and relief. He gestured toward the room with his head. "Kix thinks he can see it. The implant." Anakin's face did not change in a way an enemy would have been able to read. Rex could see it anyway. You believe him? Anakin asked, and it was not a challenge to Kix but a call to Rex's discipline. I do. Rex glanced at Kix, who met his eyes and nodded. He thinks it can be removed, but we'll need space. Cover. Anakin's hand rose and fell at his side, an old habit of a swordsman without a sword. I'll get you both that, he said. I'll talk to the temple, to the healers. They're the only facility on Coruscant that could do this without asking whose authorization overrode whose authorization. They're also the most watched facility on Coruscant, Kix said. Not in protest, but as a medic who lists variables before surgery. Let me worry about watchers, Anakin said. And when he smiled, it looked real in a way that made Kix believe him. You worry about keeping men alive. Kix's mouth tugged. Yes, sir. Anakin. Obi-Wan's voice came down the corridor like a rope thrown to a man crossing a river. He approached with his robe moving like water pulled along by a ship's hull. He took in the three of them, and the door's discreet symbol for medical access. He did not ask unnecessary questions. The council is convening in an hour to discuss the broadcast, he said. I told them you had been called to the Chancellor and would come when you could. Anakin's jaw flexed. I'll be there, he said. I need to ask them for the use of a surgery suite. Quietly. Obi-Wan's eyes softened minutely. For Kix, he asked. For all of them, Anakin said. Obi-Wan nodded. Oh, of course. Anakin looked at Rex. We're going to fix this, he said, and because he could not bear to be told that there are some things that cannot be fixed, he made himself mean the phrase the way he did when a starfighter bled on him, and he set his hands to it and brought it back into the sky. Rex nodded because he could not bear to be told there are some things that cannot be done at once. As the day passed from what everyone called morning into what Coruscant called second morning, the peel between hours when the lower levels believed it was midday and the upper levels thought night had decided to think again, the holonet became a river. The recording of Five's testimony and the Kaminoan registry jumped from channel to channel, translated at speed into Basic and Huttese and High Rill and a dozen other tongues. Each translation an echo that made the original seem both smaller and larger. Commentators appeared with faces that had been trained to look trustworthy. They asked questions in polite tones. They fretted. They called for calm. They gave calm no room to stand in. On a freighter inbound from Corellia, a Rhodian pilot watched with his hand on the throttles, and remembered a clone trooper who had given his last water to a wounded dock worker during a firefight. On a mid-rim mining station, a Sullustan foreman turned the volume up, and then down, and then off, and then on again, his voice traveling ahead of him through the corridors, like a warning. In a small home in the works district of Coruscant, a human boy with an unfinished school assignment lifted his head at the sound of the word soldier and looked toward the door as though his father might walk through it any moment and explain. Bale returned to his apartment as the light outside changed again, the glow shifting toward a lowered palette that made all the sharp things softer to the eye and no softer to the touch. The protocol droid met him with a list of messages that would require triage. He asked for quiet instead. He stood a long moment at the carved shrine and then, because Padme had told him not to tarry with this next thing, he removed the packet she had given him and broke its seal. He read the names at the top, people he knew by sight and people he knew by rumor, and felt the peculiar calm that sometimes descends on a man who has just been handed a weight he has been training to lift all his life. He reached for his secure line to Mon, and then to Padme, and then to one other number that rarely appeared in his logs, because he was careful about how logs look. A temple liaison he had learned to trust precisely because the man disliked politics and liked truth. When he had made the calls, when the replies had been set in motion, he went back to the balcony and let the ribbon wind pull the day's heat off his skin. The city hummed its ceaseless lullaby. The Senator's dome cut its soft silhouette against the sky. He placed his hands on the railing and looked down at the planet he served. He imagined Alderaan's peaks. He imagined the kind of silence that was not absence but presence. The hush between notes when a musician breathes in order to play better. Behind him, the droid cleared its throat with artificial tact. Your Excellency, it said. Captain Antilles requests a moment. He says he is on the service landing. Bale turned. "Let him in," he said, and almost smiled. Ramus knew better than to use the front door when the city smelled like storm. Antilles entered with the careful energy of a man who has run but not allowed his footsteps to tell the floor. He held a small case. He put it on the table with respect. "We're seeing strange routing through the Senate's internal network," he said without preface. "Somebody's pushing a packet into the committee scheduling system. It looks like an emergency session, but the authorization codes, they don't match anything I've seen." Bale's brows stepped slightly closer to one another. "When?" "In 2 hours," Ramus said. "After the public session closes." Bale exhaled slowly. "Who's invited?" "The list is in flux," Ramus said. "That's one problem. The other is that the location keeps shifting. It's as if someone is trying to set a meeting they don't want anyone to be able to find unless they already know where to go." Bale looked out at the city, which still looked back at him as if it could offer advice if he would only listen closely enough. "Then we'll find them before they find each other," he said. "And if we cannot, we will be waiting when they arrive, as if we were always expected." Ramus's mouth quirked. "I'll fuel the speeder." "Go," Bale said. And when the door closed behind the captain, he let his hands rest again on the railing, on the cold line that separated the apartment from the air. In the corner of his eye, dawn seemed to happen again on the skin of the building opposite, as lights came up in 100 windows at once, the city's own circadian trick. He thought of the men in white armor, and the chips snug against their skulls like a stone in a river's bed. He thought of Fives whose name had caught the chamber like a nail. He thought of the word mercy, and how much it weighed when you tried to carry it in public. He closed his eyes. The morning's tea had left its ghost on his tongue. The day had grown, as days do on Coruscant, into a thing almost too big to have a name. He opened his eyes and decided to keep using the smallest ones he had. Yes, no, now. He went inside to change his cloak. The color of the next hours would not be the one he had chosen for dawn. He wanted something darker that did not look like morning but could be mistaken for it if necessary. Across the city, in a corridor that smelled like old stone and clean linen, Temple healer Vocarache looked at a scan that was not, strictly speaking, permitted to exist, and then at a man who had always kept his promises, and asked him how many of his brothers would fit in her surgical theaters. Rex answered with a number, and then, when she did not flinch, with a plan. In the Senate's shadows, Padme handed Mon a list of names, and received a list in return. "If we can get these 5, Mon said, tapping 3 names with her fingernail and tracing 2 others as if smoothing creases, "we can hold the floor when they try to close it." "And if we cannot?" Padme asked. "Then we learn how to speak while the lights are going out," Mon said. And in the Chancellor's office, where the wood smelled like the inside of a story, Palpatine finished listening to a report delivered by a voice that wore the temple's echo like a mask, and said, with a patience that would have sounded like virtue to a different listener, "Very well." He looked at the old panels, which seemed to darken as the day passed away from them, and smiled. A slow, private thing that acknowledged an adversary worthy not of his respect, but of his time. The accelerated schedule would be fatiguing. But then, all births are labor. Night approached Coruscant, not with darkness, but with complexity. More lights came on. More shadows were created. In that layered hour, Bail Organa directed his speeder through lanes he had known since before the war, toward a place where the schedules braided and rebraided until they hid themselves under their own intent. He followed the ribbon of air. He had been taught to sail in Alderanian mountain winds, which did not care if one preferred to think of oneself as a man of cities. He let the muscle memory of those lessons live in his hands again. The storm would come. He would ride it standing, and if he had to, he would learn to breathe underwater. The city changed color. The Senate dome gleamed and then receded. Traffic slid past like fish. Somewhere, in a room that smelled of metal and clarity, a healer washed her hands again and reached for gloves. Somewhere, in a small bunkroom, a soldier lay awake and tried to imagine his skull empty of what had been tucked into it. Somewhere, in a quiet apartment, a senator's wife lit a small candle and set it before a carved shrine and did not say aloud the prayer she said every night. Bail did not pray. He made instead a plan, which is what he did when he could not endure to ask for anything. He turned the speeder into a lane that would take him beneath the Senate's belly and into the complicated quiet of its service halls. He slowed, then stopped. He breathed. Then he got out and walked toward a door that had been meant to keep him out, and would, tonight, be tested on its intention. The wind he carried with him from the balcony stirred the edge of his cloak and pulled it forward, as if to offer him to the room beyond. Ja. The door in the service hall had a panel whose glow the color of old honey meant, "Leave this to those who carry the right light." Bale lifted his hand to it and did not present himself as challenge. The trick in older buildings was not to press, but to inhabit. He let his palm rest a moment as if greeting a friend, and the sensors inside did what sensors do when presented with a signature whose edges had touched them all their life. The light went from honey to green. He did not smile. He went in. The corridor beyond had the particular smell of places where work and secrecy had shared decades, coolant in the seams, polish on the exposed sections of conduit where the paint had worn thin, a whiff of something organic and old. Paper, perhaps, or an older fabric used for sound baffling, before plastics made everything hard. Bale walked the way a man walks at night in a familiar house, remembering not to hit his shin on the same furniture as always, and still having to remind himself to lift his feet. Ramus Antilles joined him at the second junction, ghosting out of a side corridor with a small nod and the case he'd brought earlier. "They've settled it," Ramus whispered without the melodrama of whisperers. "South sublevel, room 12. That room was a court once, during the reunification. It still has the old dampers. The acoustics are miserable, unless you want them to be perfect." "That would have been my choice," Bale said. "Who's gone in?" "Mas Ameda. Orn fritaze do not ta himself. He'll come later, or not at all if he thinks it looks like work. Ask Ake. Lot Dodd, in that powdered calm of his. Two Judiciary Committee staffers with eyes that don't know how to blink." Sly Moore came to the door and then went away again. "Ben Shandawal." "Like a tide," Bale murmured. "Seer?" "Nothing." He touched the old stone of a load-bearing column with 2 fingers as they passed. A borrowed superstition. "We'll need to take a seat as if asked. Mon says she's already sent a note to the clerk on duty, reminding him that by statute, an emergency session convened under Section 7 must include a representative from the opposition floor to be valid." Bale let himself feel a brief, unfeigned fondness for the way Mon made the law into a tool as deftly as any carpenter used a plane. "Then the clerk will look relieved when we appear," he said. "Let's relieve him." They reached the stair that curved down into the older belly of the Senate complex, a place built when builders still believed that if a wall looked like stone, it should be stone, and if water had once run here, some cleverness should make it run again. The air cooled as they descended. Ahead, at the landing, a junior functionary in the trimmed robes of a clerk stood with a slate clutched in his hands as if it were a shield. When he saw Bale, his shoulders dropped in a way that said he had been braced for a blow and had decided to take it rather than try to run. "Senator," he said, and the honorific had an exhale in it. "You received my note." "I did," Bale said kindly, although the note had in truth been Mon's, pushed through 3 ducks at once to make sure. "Thank you for remembering the statute. Is the chair within?" "Councillor Ameda is presiding in the Chancellor's absence," the clerk said, with the precise helplessness of a man who has memorized a sentence to keep from saying something else. "They're calling it an informational, but they are voting on who to invite to be informed." He glanced at the door behind him, then back. "Will you take your place?" Bale did not change expression, which was the point. "We will," he said. "And you will record our presence as required." "Yes, Senator." Inside, room 12 had the odd majesty of a small space that believed it held very large decisions. The ceiling was low and barreled, the old arch reinforced with modern struts that had been painted a color approximating virtue. Dampers tucked into the curve kept spill from the voices, so sound fell straight down into the table like rain. Bale took his chair along the arc, with Ramus at the wall as a staffer who had learned the proper way to disappear, and set his palms on the cool wood to let the room make itself known. Masameda did not look surprised. He allowed surprise to be something that happened elsewhere. The vice chair's gift was to be the place where rituals went to live. He inclined his head. Senator Organa. We were just discussing how best to ensure calm among the clones while this broadcast plays itself out. I'm sure your experience will be useful. Mentor. My experience is at the disposal of the Senate, Bale said. And let the most innocuous possible sentence become a place to stand. What does the Chancellor propose? A recall? Lot Dodd said with the polished cheer of obvious things. There are medical maintenance protocols that have not been strictly observed in the outer theaters. No one's fault. War, after all, is untidy where it is not grotesque. We would simply bring the units in for a thorough cleansing. And in doing so, of course, assess the veracity of these claims about implants. Nenadolars. Recall, Bale repeated, tasting the word. You would withdraw active units from the front? For as long as required. Ask X. Long fingers made the gesture that in some cultures meant nothing and in others meant everything. There are reserves, local defense forces. Droid factories do not close when the sun sets on one planet. And who would conduct this cleansing? Bale asked, allowing his gaze to rest mildly upon Mass. The facilities we have always used, Mass said. Those under Kaminoan contract, and their auxiliaries. Bale said nothing a moment. In that moment, he let whomever in the room still knew how to think feel the cold seam at the base of the sentence. Sly Moore had not returned, but her absence had a way of making rooms feel as if someone had just walked through them. Gentle beings, he said finally, so softly that the dampers caught the syllables as if they were fragile, and set them down gently. If the allegation before us is that the thing to be cleansed is something placed there by the very facilities you propose to use, and we then send our soldiers in their millions to those facilities in a panic of recall, aren't we, at best, placing a match in the driest possible brush? Mass' thin mouth did not change shape. You assume bad faith, Senator. I assume, Bale said. The possibility of it. Let us be practical, Lot Dodd said smoothly. What is your alternative? Allow the Holonet to decide medical policy? Permit soldiers to operate on themselves in back rooms? Make the temple into a surgery? I doubt even the Jedi would invite the appearance of that kind of interference. Bale did not turn his head toward the wall where Ramus was, in his stillness, gathering the room's exhale into a net. He thought of Okarache washing her hands in a basin, not meant to catch this kind of water. He thought of Anakin's jaw tightening and the young man trying to speak the word mercy without flinching. He thought of clones sitting with their helmets in their laps, as if the helmets were answers. I propose, he said, that any medical intervention be overseen by a committee whose members do not hold financial instruments that bind them to the facilities in question. He kept his voice that same low tone. I propose that the healer's wing at the temple be included. You see? Lot Dodd said with a small flourish of a hand. It's always the temple. The day will come when we will be grateful that someone insisted upon a boundary. Mass rapped the base of his staff on the floor, not hard enough to be heard beyond the circle. Order, he said mildly. The suggestion is noted. We will of course include the temple, in an advisory capacity. Dendao. Bale let him have the word advisory, and tucked away the knowledge that Mass had said include. Rooms like this grew on the precise choice of prepositions. And who chairs this session, he asked. Mass's smile was the exact size of a respect for process. By custom, he said. The presiding officer. Then by statute, Bale returned as if continuing a conversation about the weather. The opposition floor is co-chair for any emergency question that touches upon military medical ethics. The framers had a quaint belief that war brought laws into interesting shapes. A pause. Old room, old wood, old law. Mass inclined his head 1 degree lower than before. Very well. We will have your name on the record. Thank you, Bale said, and felt Ramus' attention adjust against the wall like a starship trimming a vector. They spoke for another hour, and in that hour, the conversation traveled in careful circles, like a ritual dance whose pattern was to keep the center clear. They drafted the shape of a recall that was not called recall. They required that any clone brought into a facility for maintenance could not be moved from that facility without the oversight of the new committee. They put into words the expectation that any device found would be removed. They did not say what would happen if removal made the soldier worse. The room declined to imagine that version of compassion. When he left the room, Bale had a document on his pad that was better than the one that had been intended and much worse than Truth would have preferred. He was tired in the way that comes from having prevented harm rather than solved anything. He nodded to the clerk, and the clerk's face did that odd brave thing faces sometimes do when they see a man leaving a room with just enough still held to make the next corridor survivable. At the temple, the night made its own rooms. The healer's wing did not feel like the rest of the temple in the way a hand does not feel like a foot, but belongs to the same body regardless. Light was lower here, air cooler, footsteps deliberately softer. The hum of medical droids laid a fine line beneath the sound of voices. It made a music of its own, and the Force pressed its palm to that music's back. Rex stood bareheaded with his armor stacked like a person trying to sit in the corner and not be seen. Kix had scrubbed and scrubbed again, until his hands looked too clean to belong to a soldier. He stood beside Vocara Che at the threshold of Theater 2, as if awaiting a battle he could not fire his way through. Two other clones stood a little apart, Jesse and Dogma, each wearing the same expression men wear when they have decided to be brave in a way that will not be recorded on a ribbon. Vocara Che approached Rex. Her eyes were the deep, steady color that wood becomes when it's been oiled all its life. "Captain," she said, and there was no pretense in her voice about the word. "We will begin with you because you asked for it. That is my only criterion tonight. I have no more room for triage than that." Rex nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." "Do you meditate?" He found himself almost smiling, and the curve of his mouth made Jesse let out a breath like a chuckle caught and reholstered. "The general has tried," Rex said. "Then you will breathe," Vocara said, unmoved. "And you will keep breathing, and you will listen when I tell you to lift your breath here or lower it there. We will have anesthesia, and we will have the Force, and we will have the Force, and we will have the free instruments I will permit in my theater tonight. The rest is hands." Kix, who had tried all day to keep his own hands from shaking, looked down and saw they were steady. That was the theater's doing, or the healers, or the choice they had all made to name this thing in the open air. Anakin and Obi-Wan stood just inside the observation gallery at the top of the amphitheater, far back so that their presence was a line rather than a lens. Yoda took a stool with the gravity of a mountain and set it where the line of his sight fell on the place where Vocara would place her instruments. Mace Windu did not sit. He stood with his arms folded and the look of a man whose readiness is both a discipline and a creed. "I have asked," Mace said without looking away, "that the Council authorize an advisory to the Senate that any recall be co-located with temple healers wherever possible." Maz Ameda already reached for the word include. Obi-Wan said, "Bail will have made it more than a garnish." "So," Yoda said, and even the syllable had the shape of a staff touching stone. "Begin." "We do." Vocara took Rex's hand as he lay back, and the gesture had nothing sentimental in it. "You will dream of water," she said. "I do not know why. The temple sings that music to men like you. If you begin to drown, you will lift your hand. I will take you by the wrist, and you will not drown." "Merci one." "Yes, ma'am," Rex said again, and his eyes did not close until the droid murmured its practiced reassurance, and the air became the correct shape to carry a man gently into the part of the world where the body permits repair. The first cut was very small. Vocara made it like a woman opening a letter. She spoke aloud to Kix in the way of teachers, in places where time cannot be wasted on gentleness. "Here," she said softly. "Under the periosteel layer, you see the bright seam. No inflammation. That is interesting. It suggests that this device was designed to be a citizen. If it were infection, the body would have made its opinion known long ago. It has been tolerated." "And I wonder." "Armor under skin," Kix whispered. "Yes," Vocara said. "Polite armor." She inserted a probe with the patience of a storyteller and watched the display writhe in small, elegant lines. She hummed once, Not a melody but the note a person makes when they have found a thing that had been hiding in plain sight. "There," she said. "You see? It thinks it is part of him. The interface is diffuse. Whoever designed this had practice." "Benny." Anakin's fingers closed so hard on the railing that the metal made a tiny sound like a swallowed cry. Obi-Wan's hand closed over his, not to pull it away but to share the conduit. They stood like that for a few breaths, something that would have looked to a stranger like prayer. "This is the part," Vocara said, and the room listened in the way rooms do when only one sound matters, where we will decide who is stubborn and who is patient. "I will not tear. I will persuade. Master Yoda, if you would lend your hand." "Bend yourself." The little master's eyes had been half closed the entire time, as if he were hearing something no one else could. He opened them, and they were as old as war. "With you I am," he said. His palm lifted a few centimeters, nothing for a man accustomed to raising starfighters, and the air across the instruments shifted downward as if it too had decided to help. Rex did not drown. He dreamed of water, as promised. It was not Camino because Camino had always been a place where water was a task rather than a world. It was something else, something he had never seen, and made from the memory of an image once in a briefing. Mountains perhaps, with snow that had once been water and would be again. When the weight in his head pulled downward, he lifted his hand. A second hand took his wrist, and he breathed. The device came away. It did not like it. It had opinions. Healers do not argue with devices, not if they mean to win. They make the body argue on their behalf. Vocara coaxed, and Kix maintained the pressure at a point she indicated with his name, spoken once like a credential, and the force leaned in exactly as far as a healer's consent permitted. The thing lifted from the interface like a burr from fabric, turned in the right light. "Now," Vocara said, and Kix's breath caught audibly. In the observation gallery, Mace let out the kind of exhale that did not belong to relief. It belonged to the decision a person makes to accept the cost of relief. Anakin's eyes stung, and he rubbed the back of his wrist across them, and did not pretend it was anything other than what it was. Obi-Wan's mouth turned minutely upward at one corner, as if something in him had decided to remember how to smile. Yoda did not move, but the room felt as if someone had opened a very small window and let in air. Rex's eyes did not open for another hour. When they did, he had the look of a man who has been introduced to himself under a new light. Not distrust exactly, not surprise, the careful inventory a soldier makes when he feels for wounds he can no longer see. "How many?" he said, the words parted by dryness. "Can we do before the night is over?" "As many," Vocara said, already rising from her stool. "As your brothers can bring to my doors without being followed." "Then we do not stop," Rex said. "We do not," Kix said. "Not until my hands forget they were ever afraid to shake." Anakin left the gallery only when Obi-Wan touched his shoulder. Outside, the temple smelled different than it had that morning. The broadcast had found its way into stone. Fear does that, and so does hope. He looked east, toward the part of the city where the Chancellor's office wore the night like a well-cut coat, and he had that odd feeling again that he had described once to Ahsoka when she asked him, as she always had, the questions she was not supposed to ask. The sensation of weight before a thing falls. The sensation of weight before a thing falls. He felt it now, and beneath it, the counterweight. "Skywalker," Mace said as they walked, not unkindly. "The Senate will try to control the narrative in the morning. They will call this a maintenance procedure. They will tell the public to wait for their betters to tell them what to think." Anakin remembered Palpatine's hand on his forearm, light and paternal. "They already have a phrase," he said. "I heard it. Recalibration." Mace's mouth acknowledged the word, with displeasure. "Of course they do." He glanced at Obi-Wan. "You will go to the Senate at first light." "Yes," Obi-Wan said. "I'll speak to Bail beforehand." "Do so," Mace said. "And tell him to be ready to be grateful that he is alive, and to use that gratitude as a weapon." "You don't use gratitude as a weapon," Anakin said before he could stop himself, and saw Mace's eyes flick toward him in a way that contained both caution and a small private surprise. You do when you mean to keep something, Mace said. The Chancellor will try to make him ashamed. Men like that prefer humble opponents. They know how to take the measure of humility. Gratitude without apology makes them wary. Anakin thought of the way Palpatine had said, "Anchor." He thought of the way Obi-Wan had said, "Be steady." He felt for a moment as if he were standing between two men holding the ends of a rope, and it was not a tug of war, exactly, but something like a bridge, and he was supposed to be the plank that did not break when it flexed. In the old rooms under the Senate, Masameda dismissed the informational and watched the senators file out. He turned his head when the door closed and let his eyes rest on the old wood, as if the wood would teach him how to age without becoming brittle. He said nothing to the room. He never had. He saved his words for men who thought the right words would save them. On the mid-levels of Coruscant, Padme sat in a small office that had once been a closet, and now held a holoprojector and 2 chairs, and the sense that secrets had passed through it without staining. She had her boots off under the chair, and she rubbed the arch of one foot with the other. Not because it hurt, but because old Nabari habits had always acknowledged the body without allowing it to dictate policy. Mon sat across from her, hair loosened from its strictness, by an hour in which even hair found formality difficult to maintain. They ate fruit from a paper bag with the deliberateness of women who know that hunger makes cowards of the best of us. "They'll try a test case," Padme said, wiping juice from her lip with the back of her hand. "They'll pick a barracks where the men are tired and the commanders are exhausted, and no one knows where to look to ask permission to refuse. They'll call it a voluntary check." "Which it will be," Mon said, "for exactly 1 morning. After that, they'll bring the sticks." "Menmasatui." Padme's gaze went to the corner of the room where the paint had been nicked at some unremarked-upon moment decades ago. She thought of the chip sitting now in a sealed container in Vokarachi's lab, looking like a thing a child would swallow by accident and a mother would fish out of the throat with 3 clean taps to the back. "We have to move the 3rd packet in the morning," she said. "The one with the procurement trail that passes through 3 charities and ends up pretending to fund weather control in the expansion region. I'll take it to Taram's office," Mon said. "He owes me a favor that has not yet ripened into resentment." Padme smiled without having to show her teeth. "I will take the rural block breakfast. They always seat me near the window as a courtesy, and then forget I have ears." "Because you are pretty," Mon said with a dryness that had somehow never made her cruel. "By all means take their kindness and turn it into work." Padme laughed properly then, the small bright sound that had made handmaidens in her girlhood turn to each other and shake their heads and say they would die for her, simply because she made them think death would have purpose if she asked for it. The laugh passed. She put the pit of the fruit into the paper bag and knotted it. "He will not risk order." Mon looked at her sharply. "Tonight?" Padme shook her head. "Not tonight. Not with the broadcast still making smoke. He prefers that act clean." "Men?" "You are not wrong," Mon said, and did not say aloud the rest of the sentence, which would have asked what happens when he decides clean is no longer on the menu. Back at Bale's apartment, the protocol droid had set out a fresh carafe of tea without being asked, the way it had been taught to anticipate the needs of a household whose scale of need might suddenly expand. Bale poured, drank without checking the heat, set the cup down. Rama stood beside the table with the case open, showing the device they had used to map the emergency session's audio shadows. Not visual, Maz was too old a hand to let raw picture out of that room, but patterns of speech, lengths of silence, the shape of the room's breadth. The device had a small nick along one corner where it had been knocked against a console 10 years ago and repaired without sanding the scar. Bale found that comforting. "They'll move at dawn," Ramus said. "A soft deployment to 3 medical stations and 1 mobile unit." "The paperwork calls them diagnostic fellows." "Them?" "Names are work too," Bale said. "We'll do ours." He touched the carved shrine again, the wood worn smooth under his thumb. Breha had placed a new sprig of something green in the small cup beside it before she left to make her own late-night rounds, which were not legislative and mattered as much. He smelled the faint, peppery scent of the leaves, and imagined Alderanian wind. He had not lied to Padme when he said worse than we can think and not worse than we can stand. He had lived long enough to know both halves true at the same time. He slept for a time that would not impress anyone, and dreamed of a room in the mountains where the air was thin and clean, and work was simple, and a boy learned to tie knots he could trust with his life. At first light, the city did not so much brighten as rearrange its shadows. The Senate floor was full by the second hour, as Mon had promised Padme, because fear makes people punctual. The Chancellor opened with a statement that would have soothed anyone predisposed to be soothed. He thanked Senator Organa for his vigilance. He thanked the Kaminoans for their swift cooperation. He thanked the clones for their continued service, and urged the galaxy to think of them not as machines. He said the word as if it tasted bad, but as men. He promised oversight. He promised calm. He did not say no. Bael sat with his hands quiet, and his heart beating a little lower than yesterday. He listened. When his turn came, he spoke without ornament again. He did not waste patience on outrage. He named his committee's presence at every site. He named the first 10 healer-led theaters, open to coordinate with military hospitals across Coruscant, and then the Corps. He named a number of clones who had already volunteered for evaluation at the temple. He did not say Rex's name. He kept it in his pocket like a small bright thing he might show someone later, if he needed to remind them what a person looks like when he decides not to drown. Padme made the rural bloc laugh once, gently, and in their laughter slipped a question they found themselves answering honestly, because laughter lowers the guard. Mon persuaded Taram to hold the floor for one more breath, and during that breath, she introduced an amendment that made it impossible for a unit to be moved from one facility to another without that unit's commanding officers signed consent and the presence of a neutral observer. The amendment seemed too small to bother with unless one was in the habit of worrying about where doors lead. Masameda let it pass with a click of his staff that sounded to most like approval, and to a handful like rain behind a closed window. At the first of the diagnostic fellows, whose banner was modest, as if shyness were a credential, the clones lined up with their helmets off and their eyes forward. The medics there were good men, some of them, and women who had saved lives all their careers, and 2 of them would cry on the way home that night because they had not asked harder questions 10 years ago, when they felt an anomaly, and did not name it so. In the line, a trooper with a scar across his left eyebrow, the kind of scar men get when their heads meet the corner of a durasteel bulkhead in a hurry, shifted the way men shift when they will not scratch where it itches. He looked to his right and found a brother's eyes. Neither of them spoke. Their nod contained a plan. At the temple, Vokarache's hands did not tremble, and did not grow clumsy, and did not forget how to be kind. She removed 6 devices before midday. Kik's voice grew hoarse, and he drank water, the way a man drinks who has been told thirst is a luxury. Jesse came out of anesthesia with a laugh like a cough, and then cried a little without shame, and said he had dreamed of a planet he had never seen where the grass moved like a thing alive, and a woman with hair the color of the inside of a walnut handed him bread. "You're an artist," Kik said, squeezing his shoulder, and Jesse huffed. "In another life," he said, and Kik squeezed again because he would not permit a room that had too much grief to underpay the single coin of humor a man offered. Anakin did not leave the healer's wing. He sent word to Palpatine that he would be at the temple throughout the day, coordinating clone morale in the wake of the broadcast, and the Chancellor sent back a note that thanked him, and sounded like approval and read, to Anakin's ears, like a map with old paths rubbed clean. Obi-Wan went to the Senate, and returned with the look of a man who has walked through a field where the grass hides holes, and has marked the holes with flags for those behind him. Mace went to the archives and spent an hour standing in the light of a window that looked out over a mid-level courtyard where initiates exercised the balance of their bodies, and did not yet know that soon enough, balance would be a harder thing than practice made it. Yoda sat among the initiates when he finished with Vokara, and told a story without names about a time when the Order had had to put its hands into the gears of a machine it had not built, and learned how to do so without losing fingers. The children listened and did not understand all of it, and it did not matter. Stories are seeds that do not consult maps before they take root. By late afternoon, the first murmur of a counter-narrative rose on the holonet. A commentator of the kind who had made a career of furrowing his brow as if thinking hard called the broadcast an overreach, and the Senate's response a noble correction to panic. He had good teeth. He said the word recalibration as if it were a lullaby. He had never watched a man die of a small, well-made thing lodged where no one should have put it. Palpatine took those broadcasts as a man takes tea prepared to the temperature he prefers. He watched, turned the cup, so its handle made the right shadow against the desk, and signaled Sly Moore with a quick flick of his finger. She stepped forward and placed 2 dossiers on his desk, and he did not have to ask her which was which. He admired that about her. It is a relief, even for men who require worship, to be served by someone whose competence is not worship's child. We will not force the issue today, he said. It is better if they come. Familiarity is always the enemy of horror. Even atrocity, exposed long enough to light, begins to look like furniture. Then? Sly did not respond, because the two of them had long ago agreed that there was no point commenting on the poetry of evil. It made it vain. General Grievous? She asked instead. Let him be where he is for now, Palpatine said. He is a tool that works best when men still believe they will outwit the trap if they are quick. Kenobi? She asked. Soon, he said, and let his fingernail tap once against the lacquered edge of the desk. A small sound. A small pleasure. Skywalker is not yet tethered to the correct stake. I would prefer not to give him the excuse he wants to leap. He thought of the boy in the conference room with the blue light in his hands, and somewhere under that thought lurked a fragment of having been young, a long time ago, before he had cured himself of the burden. He set the cup down, and the saucer chimed faintly. Because the cup and the saucer had been together for so many years, they wanted each other to be exact. Night fell again, or Coruscant's version of it, which had more to do with mood than absence of light. Bail walked home with his cloak thrown back, because the air had decided to be cooler, and he wanted to feel something that did not ask him to measure it. He stopped at a lookout where people with no business in the Senate came to stare at the dome and tell themselves that someone somewhere counted for them. He stood among them like a man in a church he did not attend and listened to strangers say, I hope, and I fear, and I don't know in a dozen accents. He put his hands in his pockets and found nothing there of use but a piece of lint and the pen he had picked up in a briefing 3 days ago, with an embossed seal he had not bothered to read at the time. He clicked it without realizing. The small sound felt like stubbornness. A boy of 11, maybe 12, sidled closer and looked up at him the way children look when they think they know a man's face from a place called a screen and cannot reconcile the 3 dimensions of reality with the neatness of a picture. Bail caught his eye and made his face kind in the way that did not talk down. Long night, he said. The boy nodded and straightened his shoulders. My father says soldiers do what they're told, he said, then glanced at his mother, who had the expression mothers have when they want their children to listen while also wanting to protect them from listening. Is that true? Sometimes, Bail said, and did not lie. And sometimes they do what is right. Those are the days we have to be better than we are, so that when they do what's right, they have something to come home to. The boy considered this with the seriousness of the truly young. I'm going to be a pilot, he said. For the good side. I hope, Bail said, and meant it in the way a man means a prayer he cannot bring himself to say aloud, that by the time you are old enough to fly, the only thing we will ask you to deliver is bread. He walked on while the city's air warmed and cooled against his face in alternating currents. When he reached his door, he stood with his hand against the panel for a beat too long. Not because of any symbolism, but because that is what tired men do. Inside, Breha sat with her feet tucked under her, and a blanket over her knees, and a datapad in her lap, and her hair unbound. She looked up, and the look she gave him made all the rooms of the day line themselves up and become a house again. Did you eat? She asked, which was Nabbery and Organa, and the stubborn wisdom of women who understand that hitting one's head against the state is less survivable without soup. Fruit, he said, and came to her and leaned down and kissed her gently on the temple, and smelled the oil she had put at her hairline to keep it tame. And metaphor. Nourishing. She set the pad aside, and made him sit, and put his hands between her palms, and warmed them there, as if about to read his fortune. Will they take the men? Some, he said. Not all. We bought time. We always seem to buy time. And then we spend it. She said not unkindly. We always seem to spend it. It's a currency I thought I understood, he said quietly. Turns out it goes faster in war. She pushed one of his hands against her cheek, and he did not apologize for the smell of tea and corridors on his skin. Then buy it dear, she said, and spend it wisely. At the temple, near midnight, Rex stood outside the theater while Dogma went in. He leaned his head back against the cool stone and stared up at the line of light in the ceiling. That meant day in a place where the sun could not be seen. He thought of fives with that sudden, aching clarity that comes when the body is exhausted, and the mind has decided to stop protecting itself. He did not feel guilt, exactly. There had been no move he could have made that he had not made, no step he had not taken. But there was the weight of a name that had not been believed early enough to save the man who had spoken it. Anakin came to stand beside him. They did not speak for a long minute. The night had done to them what night does to men who have won one small thing and have yet to pay for it. It had stripped them down to being what they were when no one watched. Anakin's hands dangled loose. Rex's hands were closed on nothing. When the door opened and Kix stepped out to ask for water, both men reached at the same time, and then both smiled, embarrassed by the suddenness of care. You should sleep, Anakin said finally, like an order softened into a wish. In a minute, Rex said. After Dogma. Anakin nodded. He looked toward the room where Vocara was making her small letters in flesh. When this is done, he said, and stopped and started again. When this is done for as many as we can manage here, we'll need to take it off-world. We will, Rex said. I've already got names of surgeons in the brigades and medics who can hold a hand without crushing it. We'll need ships. We'll need stories to cover our tracks. But we'll have them. Damn. I'll ask the council, Anakin said, and then looked at Rex and added, in a voice that did not belong to a general and did not need to. I'll ask anyway. Rex huffed. You always do. They stood with that comfort between them. A strip of cloth stretched taut. Strength in the tension. Behind the door, Vocara Che said, Now, and the room breathed with her. And the city outside kept breathing as well. Because that is what cities do even when men in them have forgotten how for a while. By dawn of the second day, there were 27 chips in sealed containers in a temple lab, and a list longer than Vocara's appetite for lists of men asking to be next. There were 4 diagnostic fellows, politely stationed at medical complexes around the city with procedures ready and consent forms printed in language that called a man a unit, and his fear a variable. There was an amendment on the Senate docket that looked simple until you tried to walk around it and discovered that it had been aligned precisely with a door one had meant to use to slip through without being seen. There was, too, a small fight at the third fellow, not staged by the Chancellor's office, but not displeasing to it. A junior officer, bright, sleep-starved, knew enough not to yet have learned that following orders sometimes means disobeying them, asked too many questions and refused to sign when the medic could not tell him who had authorized the recalibration. A sergeant beside him who had once pulled him by his belt out of a fire said quietly, "Hold," and the 2 of them stepped out of line and took their helmets and walked away. And the fellow could not stop them because the room was too crowded with witnesses, and a Holonet freelancer had chosen that morning to develop a sense of vocation. In the Chancellor's office, a small vein near Palpatine's temple showed itself for a moment, and then retired. He allowed himself a thin mouth, and then let the expression pass. Delay the outer deployments, he said mildly. Let the temple fill itself with more responsibility than it has means to carry. They will do our work for us by making enemies of their allies. And if the clones begin to talk? Sly asked. They will, Palpatine said, and the word contained both satisfaction and sorrow as a performance. The right men will talk the loudest. He glanced at the second dossier. "Have you the names you promised me?" "I do," Sly said. "We will need a new lever," he murmured, almost to himself. "The old one is not yet broken, merely seen. An advantage, when visible, is sometimes stronger, but not in this case. We will find another piece of furniture for the room." "Ben?" He stood and went to the shuttered window and pressed the control, so that a thin panel of morning came in, as if morning were a thing one could decide to admit. The Senate dome sat squat and patient and a little smug, as domes often do in their cities. He looked at it, and if the dome could have felt anything, it would have felt a small, precise pressure along its ridge, as if a finger had been laid there, testing the stone. Bale, when he looked toward the same dome from a very different angle, felt none of that. He felt instead the simple human thing, the way light makes a round building look softer than it is. He put his datapad in his satchel. He checked the note from Mon. "See me first, bring the amendment." And the note from Padme. "Taram is holding. Do not take Orn's bait." And the small message from a temple liaison that said nothing about what had been done, and everything about what men had decided they wanted to be. He stepped into the day like a man who knows the room into which he is about to walk, and also understands that rooms have ways of remaking themselves when the right people enter. He breathed the city's breath and let it become his. He reached for the door to the lift, and in the long, polished metal he saw his face and did not look away from it. On a landing pad 2 levels below, Ramus Antilles argued with a fuel technician about a form no one had ever filled out before, because no one had ever decided that refueling a senator's private speeder required a statement of purpose. The technician, who had been told nothing of anything other than that she would be fired if she did not ask questions, glanced once at Ramus' face and decided, against her training and in favor of her sense that some men do not make you regret your choices, to call the requirement a suggestion. Ramus thanked her with an Alderanian politeness that made her wish, briefly, that she had been born somewhere that taught its children to make sentences that felt like bread. In the temple, Rex stood in a line of his brothers and watched Dogma walk out of the theater with a bandage under his hair and a look like he had misplaced anger, and was willing to go find it and point it in the right direction this time. Kix leaned against the wall and slid down it, and sat for a moment with his head on his knees. Vokarache took another sip of water and said, very calmly, "Next," and the next man stepped forward. Anakin closed his eyes for 4 breaths. He saw Palpatine's office without being in it. The way men sometimes see rooms they hate, as if the rooms had made a home in the mind. He saw Obi-Wan's hand on the railing, and remembered the way the metal had sung against his grip. He saw Ashoka's face once, brief, like a bird, and let the memory pass through him without trying to hold it, because he had learned that trying to hold it made it burn. He opened his eyes and squared his shoulders and said to Rex, "When this shift ends, I'll take the second watch." And Rex said, as he always did when a general forgot his rank, "Aye, sir," which was acceptance and not correction. Above all of it, Coruscant did what Coruscant does, made itself into a story told by a billion mouths at once, and somehow heard by nearly that many ears. The broadcast still ran in loops on small screens in places where men ate standing up. The word recalibration curled itself into the language like a shy snake and hissed softly when touched. The other word, mercy, waited on stoops and in kitchens and in the quiet pinch of fingers at the bridge of the nose, when someone who did not have the luxury of sleeping decided that for the next hour they would not break. No orders came that day except the old ones, the dull ones, the ones that keep rooms running and food moving and men honest when possible. The new order, the one Palpatine kept like a coin in the secret pocket of his waistcoat, sat where it always sat, warm from the body, perfectly minted, waiting for the moment when a man decides to pay and cannot be made to feel guilty for the purchase he is about to make, because he has convinced himself that the market demanded it. For now, he waited. For now, Bale spoke. For now, Padme laughed and slipped knives between words. For now, Mon made a list, and each name on it was a stare. For now, Vokarache cut carefully, and did not mistake speed for skill. For now, Rex did not drown. For now, Anakin walked the long, narrow hall between two men's versions of duty and did not run, though both versions would have been relieved if he had chosen the velocity that suited them. For now, the galaxy breathed in. What it would do on the exhale lived in the next room, where the door was closed and someone's hand rested gently on the panel, listening for the click that meant time had decided to let itself be opened.